And for the first of two different perspectives on NAFTA and the Trump administration's trade policies, we're joined at our desk by Tori Whiting, trade economist at the Heritage Foundation. And Tori Whiting, if you could put together your ideal outcome from the ongoing renegotiations, what would this NAFTA renegotiation look like?
Well, for me, a NAFTA is one that makes it easier for Americans to buy and sell with Canada and Mexico, plain and simple. So that means eliminating any barriers that are left between the three countries. You know, some key issues are things like Canadian dairy, American lumber, the ease of transferring intellectual property and things like data flows, and also the free flow of energy are probably some of the biggest things on my perspective. And really the administration should be looking at just making it easier for Americans and businesses to trade with one another with Canada and Mexico and leave all of the other protectionist stuff aside.
Were you in favor of a renegotiation in the first place?
Yes, the Heritage Foundation did support a renegotiation of NAFTA to begin with, and the reason for that is we really saw an opportunity to modernize the agreement, and that is something that shouldn't be very controversial. NAFTA is over 20 years old. We didn't even have iPhones in 1994, so there's a lot of room for improvement for just getting it up to a 21st century agreement.
Is there anything that you like so far that's come out of the renegotiation?
Well, I think that what they will hopefully be doing in terms of intellectual property and just moving the agreement into the future is definitely moving in the right direction, and we'd like to see this agreement just kind of finished up. I'd like to also see Canada back in the mix. Right now there's a lot of bilateral negotiation between the U.S. and Mexico. I'd like to have Canada be brought back in and have this really be focused on the trilateral North American relationship.
Can it be finished up with how Canada feels about the current negotiations right now? I mean, is that even possible?
I think that there is absolutely the opportunity. All three countries want to see certainty improved in North America when it comes to the existence of supply chains that have been built over 20 years. So we definitely, I think that there is optimism there, and I think that the Trump administration has been trying to move that ball forward in recent months. There's been very limited amounts of anti-NAFTA talk by the administration, and it's really about just getting it out across the finish line.
We're talking about NAFTA and U.S. trade policies for about the next hour and 20 minutes here on the Washington Journal. We're joined by Tori Whiting right now of the Heritage Foundation. Lori Wallach, Public Citizens Global Trade Watch Director, will be joining us in about 35 minutes this morning. But if you have questions, comments about the NAFTA renegotiation, now's the time to call in. Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000. Independents 202-748-8002. Tori Whiting, as folks are calling in, remind us where the United States, Canada, and Mexico stand right now when it comes to tariffs that have been imposed on each other. What do they add up to at this point?
So at this point, the tariffs that we see that are having been imposed on Canada and Mexico are under Section 232 of our trade law, which is supposed to be used for national security concerns. So it's very controversial between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And we have that being a 25% tariff on steel imports, which 16% of our steel imports actually come from Canada. So it's a big chunk of all the steel that we get, and then also a 10% tariff on aluminum. And those have been in place since about the beginning of June. I'm hoping that with these negotiations moving forward under NAFTA, that we'll be able to just strip those barriers aside. And Canada and Mexico have both retaliated against the United States with a particular interest in agriculture. I know Mexico really targeted pork, which is a huge export for us. So we just want to get all of those barriers down and focus on, just like I said before, making trade more free.
You mentioned the Section 232 being the reason that the United States have been able to impose these tariffs. Here's U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer before the Senate Appropriations Committee late last month talking about the use of Section 232.
On the issue of the 232, our objective is, the president's objective is, as we do these deals, that we, and we have done this in the case of Korea and some other countries, that we set up a mechanism whereby they don't pay those tariffs, as long as we're not in a position where they take all the benefit that's supposed to go to U.S. steel and aluminum producers. So in the case of Korea and others, we've set up a situation where they can ship duty-free in the United States up to an historic level, so that they don't get the benefit of it. But on the 232 generally, the first question you have is you have to conclude that there is a problem. Steel and aluminum are essential to national security, and that they were in jeopardy, and that prices were unfairly low. If you don't take that step, then the action doesn't make any sense. The president believes, I believe, that that was a necessary step. And then therefore, after that, the objective is to try to manage in a way so there's least amount of collateral damage while accomplish what we believe to be a good. But in the next round, I'd be happy to talk more about this with you, because I think it's the basic, and you and I have talked about these things, the basic idea, I think, is exactly what the president wants to do. He wants to get to a position where the U.S. is competing with countries specifically on a bilateral basis, and ultimately everyone on a no barrier, be it tariffs or anything else kind of basis, and then let the United States, let pure economics make the decision. And if that's the case, he's convinced, and I'm convinced, and I know you personally are very convinced, we're going to win. We're going to do just great in an environment like that.
Should mention that if viewers want to watch that testimony in its entirety, you can do that at cspan.org. But Mr. Lighthizer there mentioning that they're hoping to do this with the least amount of collateral damage. Have they succeeded in your mind?
I would say no at this point. And the reason for that is that we're seeing stories from all around the country of businesses and individuals being negatively impacted by the tariffs that have been imposed thus far. So specifically, I'm thinking of a nail manufacturer in Missouri that is having to lay off hundreds of workers because of higher steel prices. Steel prices in the United States have increased by over 40% since the beginning of the year. That's a huge margin when it comes to what our businesses that use steel and aluminum as a means of production are dealing with for their bottom line. And those industries employ roughly 6.5 million Americans. And you're looking at policies that are meant to help roughly 190,000 people at the risk of so many others.
Have those impacts, though, mostly been from the Canada-Mexico tariffs, or some of the many other tariffs that have been levied?
I think it's an overall broad picture. Estimates have us looking at potentially, the worst case scenario with the U.S. losing roughly 400,000 jobs, which shouldn't be a surprise, because under Bush in 2002, he imposed tariffs on steel imports, and the U.S. lost 200,000 jobs in 1 year. But I mean, that's going to be a slow trickle. You saw great growth numbers come out for the second quarter at 4.1%. So for these sorts of impacts to get into our actual economic numbers, there is a delay.
Taking